big week for Rivals recruiting. New face to some, a familiar face to me, one of my favorites of all time. Joining the team this week with Rivals at On3, Allen Trieu, regional recruiting analyst, national recruiting analyst, I guess now. Allen and I worked together at 24/7 Sports for years. Previously, he was at Scout. He's one of the best to ever do it, and we're pretty excited to have him on hand, especially excited because he's got some connections we're going to talk about a little bit very, very, very shortly. Allen, welcome to the team. So happy to see your face, man.
Yeah, I see your face on Instagram still from time to time, but not in this capacity. So it's nice to be reunited in a professional capacity.
Well, that's why we do it, right? I think when I left, when we were talking about me leaving, you were like, "Well, never say never. We might work together again." And lo and behold, a couple years later, here we are, and we're pumped to have you because, like I said, you're among the best, and this is a spot in the Midwest that we as a network definitely we had a hole there and we needed some work there. But at the same time, we at the Penn State site, and those that are following at Blue White Illustrated, those that are following on the Blue White Illustrated YouTube page, I think you're going to get pretty familiar with Allen because the Midwest is a hot button issue for the Matt Campbell staff at Penn State. I guess first, getting into it, can you go through your history with Matt Campbell? I know you've been covering since he was, back in the MAC. So what have you seen from Matt Campbell over the last decade or so that makes you think that it's a fit for Penn State?
Yeah. So, first, I think the previous Penn State staff always came over a little bit. We talked to each other here and there, mostly on Michigan kids, because I think when Tim Banks was around, they got into Detroit quite a bit, and Terry Smith had some connections there, but not like this is going to be. And they're going to come past Detroit over into Illinois, over into Wisconsin. You got kids from Minnesota that are being recruited by Penn State, the Dakotas. So that's very exciting. When I was just starting out, I went down to a Toledo football camp. Tim Beckman was the head coach at the time. And it's really nuts to think about now because on that Toledo staff that day, I met Coach Campbell. He was coaching offensive line. Alex Golish, now the head coach at Auburn, was on that staff. Steve Klinkscale, now with the Chargers. Lou Ianni, now with the Broncos. And I'm probably forgetting a bunch, but all of those coaches under Coach Beckman have now become major coaches in the NFL or college. And as Coach Campbell, even at that time, Toledo focused a lot of their offensive line recruiting in Ohio. They got over into Illinois at that point. And when he took over as head coach at Toledo, that continued to be the philosophy, got over into the East Coast some too. And then at Iowa State, heavily in Kansas, Iowa, Illinois, even over into Michigan, and Ohio continued to be a very fruitful place for them. When you look at their history of recruiting guys like Kareem Hunt, David Montgomery, a lot of the hits at Toledo and Iowa State were kids from the Midwest.
Yeah, I think that's going to be one of those things that the Penn State fans are going to continue to have to get used to is that, you're so used to this 6-hour recruiting radius. You're used to, recruiting Virginia, New Jersey, and all these hotbeds around here. But like you go with what you know, right? You look at how Penn State has approached the class of 2027, 0 commits right now, but a ton of interest. And a lot of that interest really, it's probably about a 50-50 split right now in terms of if you were going to pick who would jump on board first. Like the Midwest is certainly, probably at the top of the list. So I'm very intrigued to see this 2027 class play out. How do you think they left Iowa State from a relationship standpoint, from here's what we're going to be able to build on in the Midwest at Penn State, just based on how they were able to establish those relationships?
In terms of the relationships in the high schools in the Midwest and the other kind of influencers like trainers, 7-on-7 coaches, that kind of thing in the Midwest, I think the relationships are really, really strong. And I think that those relationships happen when you don't go into a region or even an individual high school and just skim the top. They wanted to get to know everybody. They took some sleepers at Iowa State. They showed themselves a lot. They were there at camps. They were there at satellite events. They did a really, really good job of canvassing the region and building those relationships and really leaving no stone unturned in terms of their evaluation. And when you see how many guys they're now recruiting at Penn State who are big time guys, where the first offer for that kid or the first major offer was Iowa State, that's proof of that. I mean, even the other schools kind of lamented, like, these guys are always first on guys in the region. And so when you do that, I think you build up a lot of goodwill.
How does the response change for a kid who gets his first offer from Iowa State, knowing the hierarchy of college football and how everything works with Big Ten, Big 12, whatever? How does that change now that they're at Penn State? If I don't know if Penn State's going to be the first offer for these guys or not, but those feelings melted away at times with Iowa State. You think Jet Tamala last year, Alabama comes in, and they've been harvested a few times for some big time prospects. Milan Paris, there are several examples of getting to a certain point and then kind of falling off. Is that something that changes at Penn State with these guys, you think?
I do think so. So first of all, I think that when you have been as successful as they were at Iowa State in recruiting and development, the challenge when you get to a place like Penn State is, how do we adapt this over here? How do we take what made us great over there and sort of amend and add to it here without maybe losing some of that in translation? So like you said, maybe they're not going to be first as much as they were at Iowa State. Maybe you don't have to do that quite as much at Iowa State, but you don't want to lose some of that. I think what translates always, though, is the personalities and the relationship building, and you still have that. But I do think that they are going to be less prone to be poached than they did at Iowa State. They always knew that that was going to be a possibility, and the examples that you gave and many others showed, and schools were really paying attention to what they did, who they offered, who they were going after. I think that's still going to happen at Penn State, but I think they're going to have a little more behind them to be able to keep those guys in the fold. So I think you still want to be early. You still want to establish those relationships. You want to get a lot of kids on campus, which they do. I thought they did a fantastic job at Iowa State of getting guys up for game days. Even kids now that the new Iowa State staff is recruiting, a lot of those kids have already touched the soil there in Ames. You keep doing that at Penn State, and with the knowledge that you're going to be able to hold on to these guys perhaps a little bit easier than you did at Iowa State.
What is the challenge there with the Midwest kids looking to get out and I just think it's different out there because of the space, because of the miles between these different schools. What is different for them as they approach, visiting Penn State? We saw Cooper Terwilliger, Case Alexander, guys like that have connections to those programs. Were able to make it in February, but it's not a place where you can go from Kansas or Iowa or something like that and visit every other weekend or something. How do you think Penn State handles those guys? When the approach has always been 6-hour radius and in.
Well, the first thing I think, you mentioned having to go where so they did. That's how you start, right? At the beginning, when you first take over, you're drinking from the fire hose. You don't have a chance to start to learn your immediate region. We see that at a couple of the schools that have coaching changes. I mean, I'm here in Michigan. It's the same thing where the staff at Michigan is going to go recruit Utah and those areas they know first. And then they're going to work their way back here and sort of establish themselves regionally and inside the state. I think that's going to happen at Penn State. That's part of the challenge is learning the East Coast. I don't think that the regions that you mentioned off the bat, the DMV, like those are going to be important recruiting areas. But at least in the start of the 2027 class, you had to go back out to the areas, especially with the kids you have established relationships with, like a Cooper Terwilliger. I think that is the challenge, though. When you have those established relationships, those kids will come. The next class, when it comes around, if you don't have that established relationship, will it be as easy to get a kid from North or South Dakota or from Omaha to come out to Happy Valley and visit? I think it's possible, but I think by that time, Penn State will have moved their recruiting a little bit more towards the east without losing some of those connections that they built at Iowa State.
I agree. I think there's a lot of natural attrition in terms of, you just kind of fade out eventually. And that's fine. I mean, you got to grow into, as we mentioned on our site before, the DMV is going to be a challenge because there's no ace there. Jersey, they hired a couple of guys. It's going to be a process to continue to get in there. And then, the old staff is 6 hours down the road in Blacksburg. So there's a lot that can work against that. So I agree. Lean on what you know. Who are some of the guys in the Midwest that, have really jumped out to you? And, we talked about a couple of names so far, but who are a couple of guys in the Midwest that, make more sense than they typically would, if that makes sense?
Yeah. I mean, off the bat, the couple predictions that I've made since coming over, Will Slagle. I mean, without this staff leaving, he's a Cyclone and he's done. And that's not a kid that traditionally, I think Penn State recruits coming over into Iowa, but I think he's going to end up in the class. I know he's got some other visits that he's going to take this spring. My sense there is this is his second time through the recruiting process. And doesn't want to make another fast decision, wants to get a chance to get to see some of the coaches that were recruiting him in new places. But everyone basically knows Penn State's the team that they have to beat. Cooper Terwilliger, we just talked about him. I mean, I think that's gone from Nebraska feeling like they were the top school there or the school to beat to Penn State now being the one. So I have a prediction in for him. Blake Benton's an interesting one. I was close to putting in a prediction for him. He has so many visits that he's taking, but linebacker from up there in Minnesota. Again, if this staff isn't here, I don't think Blake Benton probably is looking at Penn State or taking some visits. His dad said after he takes his spring visits, he's going to set his full schedule of official visits. The fact that Penn State was set prior to all of that tells me that's the one he wanted to lock in, and then he's going to figure out the rest of them later. So I think Penn State's in good position for him going into those visits.
Have you heard of Wave Fruit Farm? It's this great farm market bakery and cafe. You can shop with them either at their farm in Port Matilda or downtown State College.
No way.
Yes, Wave Fruit Farm. They have all sorts of seasonal fruits and veggies.
Way cool.
No, Wave Fruit Farm. But anyway, you should visit their bakery and cafe. They serve amazing food all day.
Way.
Fruit Farm!
Yeah, Benton's interesting because he's very, very active. And I know he said Penn State is at the top of the list, but when you take that many visits, when you are that active on the scene, it's tougher to just throw in a prediction, like an end game prediction, rather than a where's he leaning right now prediction. So I agree with you on all of those guys. Looking at the Penn State staff, who really jumps out to you as active recruiters, as their guys that are going to be leaned upon as they try to plow new ground in this region, and really who has jumped out to you over the last couple of years as somebody that's got a really good eye for what they're looking at?
Yeah, so a couple things there. First, you were talking about not really having an ace in that DMV East Coast area. I think the good thing is, the more that I've done this, the more that I've learned that it's nice to have some prior connections, but it's not 100% necessary. I said the same thing with the new staffs at Michigan and Michigan State. If you're a good recruiter, you're gonna quickly build those connections, and sometimes it's actually good to start with a blank state where the high school coaches in the region, with them, you can kind of erase the past and come in and say, hey, we're starting fresh. Maybe you saw it a little bit at the end of last cycle with a guy like Samson Gash that Penn State was able to get in on, even though the previous staff hadn't recruited him. You get to restart things, and I think that's what's going to happen up that way. So, I think on the offensive side of the ball, Ryan Clanton stands out right away. I even wrote, today about some of the guys that on the team that were going to leave via the portal and stayed largely because of him and his development history. He's a big one. Taylor Mouser, those guys have really had a great eye for talent at their other stops. On the defensive side of the ball, Deion Broomfield, I think, is a rising star in the profession. Tyson Veit does a fantastic job. He was with that staff at Iowa State, went over to Cincinnati and did a really, really good job in Cincinnati, Ohio guy. So he's going to help them be able to recruit there and towards the East Coast. So I think those are some of the ones that I have the most familiarity with that I think are going to do a really good job.
Can you put into words how much evaluating means to the staff? Because they are like stick to their guns, unlike many things that I've seen throughout college football, not even just this last Penn State staff, but they seem to know what they're looking for, sort of engage that and sort of hone in on what can make them, what can fit what they're looking for. So just what's your take on their evaluation skills, their evaluation process, and really why they're not, I haven't seen them, I don't want to say bullied into taking guys or offering guys that they shouldn't, or maybe showing excess interest. What do you think their entire approach is there?
Well, I think they knew that was going to have to be their bread and butter when they got to Iowa State. The situation that they took over there, they weren't going to be able to go and necessarily win recruiting battles. So you had to hit on some guys that other schools were going to miss. And then the more that they did it, the more that you find Will McDonald right under Wisconsin's nose and he becomes a first round pick, the more that you find Breece Hall and Brock Purdy and those guys, then I think it built a lot of confidence in them that, like, yeah, we're going to believe what we see. And then we're not only going to believe what we see, but we're going to trust that we're going to be able to develop those guys, which they've done. When schools throw out a lot of offers and early offers, like Iowa State was doing at first, the tendency for other fan bases and for other coaching staffs is to go, they're just spraying them out there. But the amount of guys that were hit on early when they did that was incredible. I mean, Iowa State did very, very little of having to turn around and not honor those offers. When they offered a guy, even when it was early, a lot of the time it stuck. That kid either ended up at Iowa State or he ended up at a major school. There was not a lot of walking back of offers. And that just shows you how good the hit rate was when they offered a player really well ahead of time in most of those cases. These guys are great examples. Blake Benton, great example. Case Alexander, guys like that they were very, very early on at Iowa State. They don't have to walk those back a lot of the time.
Are there any positions that sort of jump out to you for these guys in terms of what they've been able to develop? I know when Campbell was hired, I talked to Steve, and he kind of hammered home the quarterback aspect of scouting those guys early, taking those guys early, and they didn't always get them, but they were kind of well ahead of the curve in terms of evaluation. Are there any positions with this staff that you think that they are better than most?
Yeah, I mean, I think offensive line, I mentioned Ryan Clanton, that success goes back to when he was at Northern Iowa, where pulled a lot of rabbits out of the hat there. Like I said about, taking guys from under people's noses. They did a lot of that in his previous stops. And Coach Campbell's an O-line guy himself. So I think you have the double evaluation there. Tight end is a position that's obviously strong tradition at Penn State, but at Iowa State, I mean, they hit on a lot of guys there that when you look at their they built themselves into a school that has really strong recent tight end history. And not a lot of those guys were like high end 4-star type recruits. Those were a lot of evaluation wins that they had there. And then wide receiver. I mean, you look at the amount of, I almost couldn't believe how many wide receivers they hit on, especially in the last couple cycles you have guys like Jay Higgins and Jalen Noel and guys like that getting drafted. That was not a position that prior to them arriving at Iowa State that you saw a lot of Cyclone receivers getting drafted, and they came in right away with Hakeem Butler and carried it right out into the last couple classes with Higgins and Noel.
Interesting. Anybody in the Midwest that really jumps out at you is like, hey, this is a guy that Penn State likes. This is a guy that Penn State kind of fits. Maybe might be on the radar. I mean, we saw a rankings update last week where some of those guys went way up. But is there anybody that really jumps at you as a Penn State fit out there and sort of can make that transition to the Northeast, Mid-Atlantic, whatever it may be?
Yeah, you're talking in terms of like guys that they've offered other than the guys that have been predicted.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the one of the interesting guys that I mentioned in the article is Davis Seaman, who's an Ohio guy. Columbus guy, has an Ohio State offer. So you think right away he's just going to go to Ohio State. But Iowa State was the first offer for him. So he's going to take an official to Penn State. And I think a lot of people thought that one was a done deal for the Buckeyes, but I don't think that that's necessarily the case yet. I would still lean towards Ohio State, but Penn State's really making that a battle. Daryl Madison is a really interesting one out of Chicago. I know the staff really likes him. I think when you turn on the film, he's a potentially special player. Just hasn't got out much on the national scene yet, so I'm not sure how many schools really know about him. But he's interesting. Roman Combs is the other one I mentioned in the article. That's the type of athlete that this staff had a lot of success with at Iowa State. He's a 6'5" basketball player. He's got some lower level basketball offers. Plays corner for his high school, but at 6'5", I mean, they can convert him into a lot of different things. And I thought they did a really, really good job of figuring out where some of those positionless type athletes were. There's some really good players that they haven't offered yet in the state of Iowa. I would look at a guy like Will Clausen, who was, didn't have a ton of Power 4 interest coming up. Minnesota just offered him a few weeks ago. That's a name to look out for because I think they'll go back to some of those connections in the state of Iowa. There always seems to be kids in that state that Iowa and Iowa State dig out during the summer evaluation months. And then even into their senior year, sometimes those schools will just pop a guy late. And I think Penn State's going to keep looking over into that area as well.
What do you think they have to learn taking that leap from Iowa State to Penn State? And you mentioned I don't know about conceding, but like you mentioned having to be flexible with a 6'5", 230 athlete. I know they had and the name escapes me right now, but they had a quarterback committed a couple of years ago. They wanted to make a tight end. He ended up at Wyoming. I think he's an Incarnate Word now. Like how much of that development and sort of, I don't want to say kicking the can down the road, but how much of that kind of projection did they do? And do you think they'll have to do at Penn State now that they're in a kind of a more fruitful area?
Yeah, they did a good amount of it at Iowa State. You know, I think you have the luxury of doing it less at Penn State, but at the same time, that tends to work out. You know, and I see it work out for schools like Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin in the Big Ten, who I think those schools, traditionally speaking, have done a really good job of finding those same kind of guys. So I think you want to blend things. I don't think that in recruiting you can just have one approach of we're just going to recruit the top of the board, or we're only going to recruit sleepers and try to find diamonds in the rough. I think when you're at a place like Penn State and you have a staff that's built like this one, you have to do a little of both. If there's a Will McDonald that comes around again, you want to take that guy. They did it at the end of last year's class with Elijah Reeder. So I think they're going to continue to do that. But I think now you're at a place where you can go recruit Malachi Goodman too. So I think that's the challenge for them, is finding the right sort of blend of at what percentage do we recruit the blue chips, and at what percentage do we trust our evaluations? I think at Penn State, you slide it more towards recruiting the blue chips, but that's going to be the challenge, is getting in with the top end kids on the East Coast while still keeping your eyes open for the diamonds in the rough.
Can you kind of summarize the challenge that they had from a money standpoint? Obviously, Penn State is not at the top of the list, but probably a little bit more in the bankroll there for NIL. How do you think that changes things for Matt Campbell at Penn State, and how much can you blend the old versus the new when it comes to this entire recruiting game?
Yeah, I think that is a challenge, because you have more of a budget than you had to work with at Iowa State. I know for a fact that Jet Tamala, I think if they could have just gotten the money up a little bit more, it wasn't, he wanted to stay at Iowa State for a time period, and the NIL was a big part of that. I think when you look at Penn State now, they're going to have more to work with than they did at Iowa State, but you're also recruiting against schools who have bigger budgets. So that to me is the challenge, is we have this to work with now, but the other schools that come up here and recruit the best of the best in that East Coast region, they're going to be able to throw out some serious NIL. So I think that's where you have to decide where you're going to allocate those funds, and then you trust your evaluations on the rest of that crew. And so I think for the fan base, you're going to have to be patient and understand that they may not just walk in and start winning 5-star and high 4-star battles out there, although I think they're going to give it a good effort. But this is a staff that every message board says trust their staff, right? This group has earned the right to do that. Every fan base says that, and sometimes their coaching staffs don't have the cachet that this one does. When you look at their hit rate, if they offer a guy who doesn't have a ton of offers and may not be ranked, may not even be in a database from time to time in the past, typically that's worked out.
We're in the first week of March, and I know there's some already off the train, so which is just incredible to me. Just like you're looking at a staff that's proven it, and you're going to give them the benefit of the doubt to come in and evaluate, and you're going to give them the benefit of the doubt to develop. And it's 3 months in, and here we are. 4 months in, and here we are. So that's always fun, right?
They're not alone though. Like I said, I'm in a state at Michigan and Michigan State where the people here are the same. It's like, how come in-state kids aren't just falling out of the sky for either of the staffs? And knowing a lot of these staffs that have switched places, it wasn't until this recent dead period where a lot of them could even unpack themselves, right? They were all in suitcases and temporary housing until about now. So my message to all those fan bases with new coaching staffs is let them get settled in, let them build some relationships, and really even let them get through, I think, one full cycle before you can really say much about how recruiting goes in the spring. There's a lot, especially with the way the calendar is now. You jump right in and you're thrown into portal season, and also let's save our roster first of all, and then you get a chance to catch your breath and maybe try to make some of the connections with these 27s.
Yeah, I think it's a natural casualty here with the February dead period, because you're looking at jumping into saving your roster, number one, building your roster in the portal, and then all of a sudden, 2 junior days for most places, maybe 3 if you're lucky, and then the February dead period hits. I did something on the site the other day about how many commitments have actually been picked up since most coaching changes in Power 4 have happened, and I think the most is 2. So it's a pretty remarkable case study in patience, number one, and number two, just kind of how this is all playing out, especially, with the money aspect coming into play, with official visits in summer being as important as they've ever been. How much growth we see from January to May or June is sort of curtailed. So that's been interesting. I guess my last question: you knew the prior Penn State staff pretty well. You know the staff pretty well. What are the differences that you're looking between the two staffs, and how does one? Not saying one's better than the other or anything like that, but what differences do you expect from an approach standpoint, from an effectiveness standpoint, between James Franklin's staff and between Matt Campbell's staff?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you have two head coaches in James Franklin and Matt Campbell who take a very active approach in recruiting, but have fairly different personalities in how they approach that. Coach Franklin, I think both very personable, both very well spoken. But I think Coach Campbell has definitely a little bit more of this Midwest feel to him. I mean, he's a Midwest guy through and through, a little bit more understated. And I think that that's how they're going to recruit. Also, that's the philosophy of we're going to trust our eyes and trust our evaluation. I think they're going to move to the point where it's closer to what the last staff did of, like I said, recruiting the national board, but you're going to get some exciting hits as well of some guys that, like I said, they're going to pull some kids that surprise you. Elijah Reeder is a good example from the end of last class where he's in Jersey. Nobody knows that guy. Iowa State finds him. We thought the film was fantastic once we finally sat down and were able to kind of settle it out and see what that kid was all about. You're going to get some of that. So I think that the philosophy is the same in that recruiting is the lifeblood. It's very important. When you talked earlier about, which assistants are strong recruiters, it's all of them. They're all expected to. And that was the case under Coach Franklin is everybody's got to pitch in, everybody's got to recruit. That's the same with this staff. And I think that comes from the head coach. And the head coach isn't just the closer. He's very involved throughout the process. So I think those are the similarities between the two. And one last thing I want to say too is I think now in college football, very important that you have more than one off-field person who's capable. And I think they've got several. I know Derek Hoodger has done a really, really great job at Iowa State, and he's going to bring that over to Penn State. But he's got several hands on deck with him that I think do a great job. And in today's college football, we just mentioned all the different things you have to do with the portal and retaining your roster and then still recruiting high school kids. I think they have a really, really strong off-field department.
Yeah, it's definitely a work in progress, but it's a fun work in progress because you can kind of see it play out in front of you, which is not always what we're used to, especially after James Franklin being here for 12 years. I mean, it's just a different sort of gear to switch into, and I think it's been fun to see how they've sort of stuck to what they learned and cut their teeth at Iowa State, but also that broad horizon when they get to Penn State. So it's going to continue to be fascinating to watch. We're going to follow it here on BlueWhiteIllustrated.com, on the Blue White Illustrated YouTube channel. And Allen Trieu is going to be a big part of it. Allen, again, psyched to have you back on the same team. Again, one of the best in the business. Go ahead and throw him a follow on Twitter because there's going to be a lot of Penn State stuff coming. So Allen, thank you very much for joining us.